Time is both generous and treacherous, cruel and healing, cruel in its implacable flow, caring nothing for the ravages of aging and death that it carves into our lives, but healing in the grief that it gradually dissolves and carries away, never completely. Generous in the life and the beauty that it grants to us, treacherous in the way that it begins undermining those gifts almost as soon as they are given. One of my favorite Shakespearean sonnets puts it this way: like as the waves that make toward the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil, all forwards do contend. Life, nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, wherewith being crowned, crooked eclipses against his glory fight, and the time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. We hear talk of hope and determination in these dark times. Hope for a new vision for Unitarian Universalism, hope for our world, our planet, our human society. The webs in which we live and do our work have, in recent years, been tattered. Indeed, have had much of their traditional integrity violently rent apart. Political webs, social webs, the web of our nation, of our planet, indeed our own Unitarian Universalist web, has been severely frayed over recent years. And in the face of that, I have come to think that one of our tasks, maybe the most important task, as persons and as members of our liberating religious tradition, may be to serve as the caretakers of the web, the weavers, or perhaps the reweavers. I was inspired about a year ago by this notion of weaving in reading one of my favorite New York Times columnists, David Brooks. Maybe some of you know him and read him too. He wrote about what he called weaver politics. The best future politics, he wrote, puts collaborative pluralism, weaving, at the center. Now, he wrote this more than a year ago in the early summer when the Democrats were still debating who their presidential candidate was going to be. You know, the stage full of 12 candidates up there. He said, David Brooks said, that weaver politics means first electing leaders who are masters at cooperation. And then he said, no offense, but if you're supporting either Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders this year, collaboration skills are not high on your list of priorities. And he goes on to say, the weaver movement is repairing our country's social fabric, which is badly frayed by distrust, division, and exclusion. People are quietly working across America to end loneliness and isolation and weave inclusive communities. That resonates for me with our own UU image of the web as a model for human relationship to one another, to the whole human family, even to the cosmos. When we eventually emerge from pandemic isolation, maybe the first task will be to reweave the clothing of our own lives as we find new rhythms, new goals, new structures, new patterns, find new intersections in the web that will enrich us in new ways. But we need to look beyond ourselves and our families. Weaving has so often been a communal task, a social task, like quilting. I think of quilting bees, where the goal is, yes, to make a quilt, but the deeper meaning is the weaving of the social fabric that takes place through the talk, the conversation, the shared storytelling, and attending not only to our own little regions of the web, but to the larger web of the common good. And in thinking about doing that, we have first some sobering realities to attend to. I think this pandemic has placed the history of this land and its occupants in some very much needed new light. And I'm speaking now as a white person to you as a congregation of mostly white and mostly privileged people. I see in this last 18 months of COVID pandemic a metaphor for the social pandemic of ethnic and racial oppression, and more recently, religious oppression that has gone on for 400 years in North America. Most of us haven't been forced to pay attention to that reality for much of our lives. Only in the last 60 years has our Unitarian Universalist movement woken up to the reality, really to the reality of that horror. And you know what I'm talking about. You know the arrival of the first slave ship in Virginia in 1619, 402 years ago. You know the stories of genocide, despite some friendly anecdotes in our ancestors' relation with the Indians. You know the horror stories too. Black stories are being heard, really heard, in this last decade for the first time in new ways, with the deaths of Black people murdered at the hands of police. And the pain of those communities comes bursting out like a fire in the soul, as Jeremiah said. If any of you follow opera, you may know that the Metropolitan Opera in New York is reopening, and just, I think, this coming weekend, with a new opera called Fire Shut Up in My Bones, the first time that an opera by a Black composer has ever been staged at the Met. Fire Shut Up in My Bones. Remember that comment from Zora Neale Hurston. There is no agony like the agony of a story withheld and not being told. And we are hearing more and more from indigenous voices here in Northern California, from people who belonged to this land for more than 10 millennia until they were enslaved by Spanish invaders and the land was forcibly seized some 300 years ago. Native American scholars like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and Dina Gilios Whitaker, Beacon Press authors, by the way, if you want to look up their books, are bringing to light history that has been bottled up for centuries, history and stories that are burning to be told, to be shared, to emerge into the light of day so as to reshape our own understanding of some of our own history. A week ago, we were reminded as we marked the 20th anniversary of those attacks on the New York World Trade Towers and the Pentagon and the aborted attack aimed toward the White House. We've been living in some dark times since 9/11, 20 years ago. We've increasingly become a suspicious people, a fearful and divided and polarized and tribalized people. The first known casualty of the post 9/11 fear happened just 4 days after 9/11, 20 years ago, when a follower of the Sikh religion named Balbir Singh Sodhi was planting flowers in front of the gas station that he owned in Fresno, California. And he was attacked by a white man who is reported to have said that he wanted to go shoot some towel heads. Balbir's death marked the first of what has become a string of hateful actions and hateful rhetoric over the past 20 years. Balbir's niece, Valerie Kaur, found her life changed by that day when her uncle was murdered in front of his gas station. She's recently published a book called See No Stranger. Maybe some of you have heard it and heard of it. A memoir and a manifesto of revolutionary love. Valerie Kaur asks prophetically in these dark times that we live in, is this the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? It is we who will give the answer to that question. If our lives have become unraveled in the darkness of these times, it is we who will have to redeem the time. We must, in Shakespeare's words again, find ways to knit up the raveled sleeves of care, to knit up the preserved threads of our lives and reweave them. The stories, the threads lie before us and within us, waiting, needing, crying out to be rewoven. And it is we who must take up these threads of life, of our lives, if they are to be preserved in meaning, if they are to be given new life, woven into something new, some new fabric. It is to each of us alone to whom it is given to weave our particular threads in part of that, as our part of that communal process. Weave them into the web and the fabric that will sustain the future, that will restore integrities, that will recreate community fabrics and our nation. And in important ways, the fabric of this congregation. Like Tom Stoppard's Travelers, we are marchers in time. What we weave, we will carry with us for a while and then leave it when we die. But nothing is lost. First, because other travelers will come along to find and make use of our weavings. And second, that all that we ever say or do or think or weave or create is preserved in the world in some ways. In some of our theologies, we call that the everlasting life of God. In other, less personal ways, we have metaphorical references to describe how that works. But in any case, whose stories we do remember and tell and retell until they are woven permanently into our memories are important. It is we who will decide, we who will act. It is we who must live for the common good and for one another in our weaving of the future that we co-create. And so I invite, I encourage, I embolden you to engage in storytelling with one another in person when it becomes possible again. And of course, storytelling implies listening, careful listening, and digging deep within our own memories, our fears, our hopes and dreams. Tell the stories of those elders who have passed from among you. Listen and retell the stories of oppressed people whose voices have been too long silenced or ignored. Weave all these stories together into a new and stronger fabric of compassion and cooperation and community and congregational life, a truly interdependent web of human relationship. And to repeat those opening words that Maggie read for our Chalice Lighting this morning. O spinner, weaver of our lives, your loom is love. May we who are gathered this morning be empowered by that love to weave new patterns of truth and justice into a web of life that is strong, beautiful, and everlasting. May it ever be so. Amen.
Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This congregation depends entirely upon the generosity of its members and friends. All that we give in time, talent, and treasure is what sustains this community and makes it not just a sanctuary for us to return to for spiritual nourishment, but an oasis from which we can go out into the world carrying the waters of life. You can donate by going to our website at nvuu.org and clicking on the yellow donate button, which is on the left-hand side. Or you can send a check to NVUU at 1625 Salvador Avenue, Napa, California, 94558. The offering will now be gratefully received.